In the bitter winter of 1849, while the potato famine devastated Ireland and desperate immigrants flooded New York's shores seeking salvation, a construction crew breaking ground for the expansion of St. Patrick's Cathedral made a discovery that would haunt the Catholic Church for generations. 89 bodies, arranged in ritualistic patterns beneath the sacred foundation stones, their remains bearing evidence of systematic torture and deliberate concealment. For over 170 years, the Church's official records claimed these were cholera victims given Christian burial, but recently discovered private correspondence from Bishop John Hughes reveals a conspiracy of silence, murder, and ecclesiastical corruption that makes the Spanish Inquisition look merciful. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truth about what happened in those candlelit catacombs beneath America's most famous cathedral will shatter everything you thought you knew about religious authority in the New World. Before we descend into darkness beneath St. Patrick's Cathedral and uncover the bishop's most terrible secret, we need you to join our community of truth seekers. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments which city or state you're watching from. We love connecting with fellow investigators who aren't afraid to question official histories, no matter how sacred they claim to be. Now let's uncover what really happened in those stone corridors beneath Fifth Avenue, where prayers echoed above while screams echoed below. The year 1849 found New York City transforming at a pace that left even longtime residents dizzy with change. The population had exploded past 500,000 souls, making it the largest city in America, a sprawling metropolis where Irish immigrants fleeing starvation worked alongside German craftsmen, Italian stonecutters, and freed slaves, all struggling to build new lives in the shadow of towering church spires and factory smokestacks. St. Patrick's Cathedral stood at the heart of this transformation, its Gothic Revival architecture rising majestically on Fifth Avenue between 50th and 51st Streets. Bishop John Hughes, known throughout the city as Dagger John for his fierce defense of Catholic interests, had conceived the cathedral as more than a house of worship. It would be a monument to Catholic power in a Protestant nation, a declaration that the Irish and other Catholic immigrants were not merely temporary refugees, but permanent citizens with the right to build something magnificent. But Bishop Hughes harbored secrets that went far beyond architectural ambition. Behind his public image as a champion of the downtrodden lay a man consumed with consolidating power, eliminating threats and ensuring that nothing would prevent the Catholic Church from achieving dominance in America's fastest-growing city. The construction of St. Patrick's Cathedral provided the perfect cover for activities that would have scandalized even his most devoted parishioners. Hughes had arrived in New York in 1838 as coadjutor bishop, inheriting a diocese fractured by ethnic tensions, theological disputes, and financial scandals. Irish immigrants, desperate for spiritual guidance in a hostile Protestant environment, had placed their trust in priests who often exploited that trust for personal gain. German Catholics maintained their own parishes and refused to acknowledge Irish ecclesiastical authority. Italian Catholics practiced a folk Catholicism that horrified Irish clergy with its mixture of Christian and pagan elements. Into this chaos stepped Bishop Hughes, determined to forge unity through whatever means necessary. His first targets were the rebellious priests who challenged his authority, men who had grown comfortable with their independence and saw no reason to submit to an Irish bishop's vision of centralized control. Father Antonio Brescia, who ministered to the Italian community in Lower Manhattan, had been particularly vocal in his opposition to Hughes's efforts to anglicize Catholic worship and suppress traditional folk practices. Father Heinrich Zimmermann, beloved by German immigrants for his willingness to conduct services in their native language, had refused Hughes's directive to transition to English-only masses. Father Patrick O'Sullivan, despite sharing Hughes's Irish heritage, had been embezzling funds from St. Mary's Parish to support what he claimed were starving relatives in County Cork, but which Hughes suspected were going to support Irish Republican activities that could bring unwanted government attention to Catholic institutions. Rather than risk public scandals that might undermine Catholic credibility in a city already suspicious of papist influence, Hughes chose a more direct approach. One by one, the troublesome priests began to disappear. Their parishioners were told that Father Brescia had been reassigned to minister to Italian communities in California. Father Zimmerman had allegedly returned to Bavaria to care for an ailing mother. Father O'Sullivan had been transferred to a mission parish in the Dakota Territory, where his linguistic skills would be valuable in converting Native American tribes. The truth was far more sinister. Hughes had established what he privately called the Tribunal of Sacred Discipline, a secret ecclesiastical court that operated according to medieval canon law rather than American legal principles. Priests accused of heresy, embezzlement, or rebellion against episcopal authority were tried in secret proceedings held in the catacombs beneath St. Patrick's construction site, spaces that would eventually be sealed and forgotten once the cathedral was completed. The tribunal consisted of 3 men whose loyalty to Hughes was absolute, and whose willingness to employ extreme measures had been tested in Ireland during the violent conflicts between Catholic and Protestant communities. Father Cornelius Murphy had served as Hughes's secretary since 1840, a thin, pale man whose soft voice concealed a fanatical devotion to ecclesiastical discipline. Brother Thomas Flanagan, officially the diocese's treasurer, had previously worked as an enforcer for Catholic secret societies in County Mayo, where he'd learned techniques for extracting confessions and ensuring permanent silence. Most disturbing of all was Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a convert from Episcopalianism whose medical training made him invaluable for determining how much physical persuasion the human body could endure before succumbing to injury or shock. Whitmore had been stripped of his medical license after allegations of conducting unauthorized experiments on charity patients, but Hughes had provided him sanctuary within the church hierarchy, where his particular skills could be employed for what the bishop considered the greater good. The tribunal's proceedings followed a twisted logic that combined religious authority with practical necessity. Accused priests were given opportunity to confess their sins and accept whatever penance Hughes deemed appropriate, which usually involved permanent exile to remote missionary posts where they could cause no further trouble. Those who refused to cooperate, who insisted on their innocence, or who threatened to expose Hughes's methods faced escalating levels of interrogation designed to break their resistance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Father Brescia had been the first to experience the tribunal's full attention. Accused of teaching heretical doctrines by incorporating Italian folk traditions into Catholic worship, he had initially defended his practices as legitimate expressions of regional Catholic culture. When gentle persuasion failed to convince him to abandon these customs, Dr. Whitmore had employed techniques he claimed were designed to focus the mind on spiritual rather than worldly concerns. The sessions took place in a chamber carved from the natural bedrock beneath the cathedral site, illuminated by candles arranged in patterns that Whitmore insisted would create an atmosphere conducive to spiritual revelation. Father Brescia had been subjected to periods of sensory deprivation alternating with intense interrogation, his captors explaining that they were helping him experience the dark night of the soul that all true mystics must endure before achieving perfect submission to divine will. When psychological pressure proved insufficient, the tribunal had escalated to physical methods that Dr. Whitmore carefully calibrated to cause maximum discomfort without leaving obvious evidence of torture. Father Brescia's resistance had lasted 3 weeks before he finally agreed to confess his errors and accept exile to the California missions. But by then, The sustained stress and physical abuse had damaged his health beyond recovery, and he had died 2 days before his scheduled departure for the West Coast. Rather than risk discovery of his body, Hughes had ordered it sealed in the catacombs, the first of what would become a hidden cemetery for those who had opposed the bishop's vision of Catholic unity. The official story maintained that Father Brescia had departed for California as planned, and letters were periodically sent to his former parishioners, allegedly from their beloved priest, describing his successful ministry among the Italian communities of San Francisco. Father Zimmermann's resistance had been even more determined. A scholarly man who had studied theology at prestigious German universities, he had challenged the tribunal's authority on canonical grounds, citing church law that required formal charges, proper defense, and appeal processes for any ecclesiastical trial. His legalistic approach had infuriated Hughes, who saw such procedural objections as evidence of the prideful intellectualism that threatened to undermine simple faith. Dr. Whitmore had been given permission to employ more aggressive techniques. With the German priest, methods he claimed were based on ancient practices used by medieval inquisitors to purify heretical souls. Father Zimmermann had endured 6 weeks in the underground chamber, his interrogators explaining that his suffering was a form of purgatory that would cleanse him of the sin of intellectual pride and prepare him for humble acceptance of episcopal authority. The priest's final weeks had been documented in Dr. Whitmore's private journal, a meticulous record of physical and psychological deterioration that the doctor viewed as scientifically valuable data about human endurance under stress. When Father Zimmermann finally died, still refusing to confess errors he insisted he had not committed, Hughes had ordered his body placed alongside Father Brescia's in the growing catacomb cemetery. Father O'Sullivan's case had been different, because his crimes involved money rather than doctrine, making him potentially more dangerous to the church's reputation if his embezzlement became public knowledge. Hughes had hoped that the Irish priest's ethnic solidarity would make him more amenable to cooperation, but O'Sullivan had proven surprisingly defiant when confronted with evidence of his financial irregularities. The priest had claimed that his appropriation of parish funds was justified by the church's moral obligation to support Irish independence from British rule, an argument that might have carried weight with Irish parishioners, but which Hughes recognized as potentially catastrophic if it reached Protestant ears. American nativists were already suspicious of Catholic loyalty to foreign powers, and any suggestion that Catholic churches were funding revolutionary activities would provide ammunition for those seeking to restrict Catholic immigration and influence. Brother Flanagan had taken personal charge of O'Sullivan's interrogation, his experience with Irish secret societies making him uniquely qualified to counter the priest's appeals to nationalist sentiment. The sessions had been particularly brutal, because O'Sullivan's claims of patriotic motivation had struck Flanagan as blasphemous appropriation of legitimate resistance activities for personal financial gain. Unlike the Italian and German priests, O'Sullivan had eventually broken and confessed not only to embezzlement, but to a broader pattern of corruption involving the sale of false documents to Irish immigrants, the operation of illegal gambling establishments in church basements, and the systematic extortion of Irish families desperate for priestly intervention in personal crises. His confessions had provided Hughes with valuable intelligence about corruption within the Irish Catholic community, but they had also revealed the extent to which his own episcopal authority had been undermined by priests who viewed their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than spiritual service. O'Sullivan's death had been the result of what Dr. Whitmore described as cardiac failure brought on by the extreme stress of confronting his own moral degradation. The priest had apparently suffered a massive heart attack while Brother Flanagan was reading aloud the list of families he had cheated and the amounts he had stolen from their children's education funds and their grandparents' funeral collections. By the spring of 1849, The catacomb cemetery beneath St. Patrick's construction site contained the remains of 17 priests, 3 deacons, and 6 lay Catholics who had somehow discovered evidence of the tribunal's activities and had to be silenced before they could expose Hughes's methods to civil authorities or rival Protestant denominations. The bishop had convinced himself that these deaths were necessary sacrifices for the greater good of Catholic advancement in America, martyrs in a secret war against the forces that sought to prevent the Church from achieving its rightful influence in the New World. But Hughes's paranoia had grown with each new addition to his underground cemetery. He had become convinced that enemies were everywhere, that Protestant ministers were infiltrating Catholic services to gather intelligence, that rival bishops were plotting to expose his methods to Rome, that even his most trusted advisors might be secretly documenting his activities for future use against him. Dr. Whitmore had begun to concern Hughes with his increasingly detailed journal entries and his obvious fascination with the psychological effects of prolonged stress on religious individuals. The doctor's scientific approach to what Hughes preferred to view as necessary spiritual discipline suggested a level of intellectual detachment that the bishop found unsettling. Brother Flanagan's enthusiasm for the physical aspects of interrogation had also begun to worry Hughes, who suspected that the former enforcer was enjoying the violence more than was appropriate for someone engaged in sacred work. The brother's suggestions for new techniques often seemed motivated more by curiosity about human suffering than by legitimate concern for extracting confessions or ensuring silence. Even Father Murphy, whose loyalty had never been questioned, had recently been asking uncomfortable questions about the theological justification for the tribunal's methods, wondering aloud whether the secrecy surrounding their activities might suggest that they were straying from authentic Catholic doctrine into practices that resembled the worst excesses of medieval corruption. Hughes had reached the conclusion that the tribunal itself had become a threat to the security he had sought to create. The 3 men who knew all his secrets were now the 3 men most capable of destroying him, and their knowledge made them too dangerous to trust indefinitely. The bishop had begun planning what he privately called the final discipline, a conclusion to the tribunal's work that would eliminate the last witnesses to his methods and allow him to complete St. Patrick's Cathedral with a clean conscience and a secure future. The opportunity had come in late November 1849, when city building inspectors had announced plans to examine the cathedral's foundation work as part of routine safety oversight. Hughes had realized that any official inspection of the construction site would inevitably lead to discovery of the catacomb chambers and their gruesome contents, exposure that would destroy not only his own career but the entire Catholic presence in New York. Rather than risk such catastrophic revelation, Hughes had invited his 3 confederates to what he described as a final celebration of their successful work together, a private mass in the catacomb chamber where they had conducted so many interrogations. The service would be followed by a consecration ritual that would spiritually cleanse the space before it was permanently sealed and incorporated into the cathedral's foundation structure. Father Murphy, Brother Flanagan, and Dr. Whitmore had arrived at the construction site after midnight on November 28th, expecting to participate in a solemn religious ceremony that would mark the end of their secret tribunal and their transition to conventional ecclesiastical duties. Instead, they had found themselves trapped in the underground chamber as Hughes and a team of trusted Irish laborers began sealing the entrance with stone and mortar. The bishop had explained through the rapidly narrowing opening that their deaths were necessary to preserve the greater mission of Catholic advancement in America, that their sacrifice would be remembered by God even if it could never be acknowledged by earthly authorities. Their voices pleading for mercy and then screaming in rage and terror had echoed through the underground chambers for nearly 3 days before silence finally settled over the catacomb cemetery. Hughes had personally supervised the final sealing of the chambers, ensuring that no trace remained of the entrance or the horrors contained within. The construction records have been altered to show that the foundation work in that section had proceeded according to plan, with no unusual excavations or structural modifications. The Irish laborers who had assisted in the ceiling had been quietly transferred to construction projects in other cities, their silence purchased with generous payments and implicit threats about what might happen to workers who discussed confidential church business with unauthorized persons. As Christmas approached and St. Patrick's Cathedral continued rising toward the winter sky, Bishop Hughes had finally achieved the security and control he had sought since arriving in New York 11 years earlier. The troublesome priests were gone, the tribunal was disbanded, and the witnesses to his methods were permanently silenced. His vision of Catholic power in America could proceed without the threat of scandal or exposure. But the bishop had underestimated the persistence of human curiosity and the tendency of secrets to surface when least expected. The construction workers who had been transferred to other cities had carried with them stories about strange sounds from beneath the cathedral, about priests who had disappeared without proper farewells, about midnight meetings and sealed chambers that didn't appear on any official building plans. More significantly, Dr. Whitmore's medical practice had included a young apprentice named Samuel Hartwell, a Protestant convert to Catholicism whose admiration for his mentor had led him to maintain detailed copies of the doctor's journals and correspondence. When Dr. Whitmore had failed to return from what he had described as an important church meeting, Hartwell had begun investigating his mentor's recent activities and had discovered the horrifying record of the tribunal's work. Young Hartwell faced an impossible choice. Exposing the truth about Bishop Hughes's activities would certainly destroy the Catholic Church's reputation in New York and might trigger violent retaliation against innocent Catholic families by Protestant mobs seeking revenge for the concealed murders. But remaining silent about mass murder committed under religious authority would make him complicit in crimes that violated every principle of justice and human decency. The decision that would ultimately expose the truth came from an unexpected source. Margaret O'Brien, the younger sister of Father Patrick O'Sullivan, had received the last of the forged letters allegedly sent from the Dakota Territory and had noticed discrepancies that convinced her something was wrong. Her brother's handwriting seemed different, his usual expressions were absent, and most tellingly, he had written about ministering to Lakota tribes, using theological concepts he had never demonstrated any knowledge of during his years in New York. Margaret had shared her concerns with other family members of disappeared priests, and together they had begun investigating what they increasingly suspected was a pattern of deception designed to conceal something terrible. Their inquiries had eventually brought them into contact with Samuel Hartwell, and the combination of Dr. Whitmore's journals and the family's growing evidence of systematic deception had created an alliance dedicated to uncovering the truth about Bishop Hughes's secret activities. The investigation that would ultimately expose the cathedral cemetery had begun in the winter months of 1850, as Margaret O'Brien, Samuel Hartwell, and the relatives of missing priests slowly pieced together evidence that pointed toward mass murder concealed beneath the most sacred ground in Catholic New York. The winter of 1850 brought Margaret O'Brien closer to a truth that would shake the foundations of Catholic power in America. Working by candlelight in her modest apartment on Mott Street, surrounded by her brother's letters and Samuel Hartwell's copied medical journals, she had begun to see patterns that revealed the scope of Bishop Hughes's conspiracy. But uncovering evidence was only the beginning of her challenge. Exposing a man who commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of Catholic immigrants while maintaining the respect of Protestant civic leaders would require courage that few possessed and allies willing to risk everything for justice. Margaret's investigation had revealed that the disappearances followed a precise methodology. Each priest had first been isolated from his supporters through carefully orchestrated character assassination campaigns. Anonymous letters would circulate suggesting financial improprieties or theological errors. Parishioners would report strange behaviors or suspicious meetings, Fellow clergy would express concerns about the priest's mental state or spiritual condition. By the time formal accusations were made, the targeted priest's reputation had been so thoroughly undermined that his sudden departure seemed like a relief rather than a loss. Samuel Hartwell's medical training had helped him recognize the systematic nature of Dr. Whitmore's documentation. The journal entries described experimental protocols for psychological manipulation, detailed observations about human responses to isolation and stress, and clinical assessments of how much physical pressure different personality types could endure before psychological collapse. What had initially appeared to be random cruelty was actually methodical research designed to perfect techniques for breaking human resistance to authority. Most disturbing were Dr. Whitmore's theoretical writings about the application of medieval Inquisition methods to modern religious conflicts. The doctor had become convinced that American Catholicism's survival depended on absolute internal discipline, that the individualistic tendencies encouraged by Protestant culture were incompatible with proper Catholic submission to hierarchical authority. His experiments on captured priests were intended to develop reliable methods for identifying and eliminating what he called Protestant contamination within Catholic communities. The deeper Margaret and Samuel delved into the evidence, the more they realized they were confronting not just individual crimes, but a systematic program designed to transform American Catholicism into something resembling European Catholicism's most authoritarian periods. Bishop Hughes hadn't simply been eliminating troublesome priests. He had been conducting research into methods for ensuring permanent obedience among Catholic populations who had grown accustomed to American freedoms. But their investigation had also revealed something that gave Margaret hope for justice. Dr. Whitmore's obsessive documentation had included detailed maps of the catacomb chambers, precise inventories of human remains, and careful records of which personal effects had been buried with each victim. If they could somehow gain access to the sealed chambers beneath St. Patrick's Cathedral, they would find evidence so overwhelming that even Bishop Hughes's powerful allies couldn't suppress or explain it away. The challenge was finding a way to reach those chambers without alerting Hughes to their investigation. The cathedral construction site was heavily guarded, and any unauthorized excavation would immediately draw attention from church authorities. Margaret needed to find someone with legitimate access to the construction area, someone whose presence wouldn't arouse suspicion, and someone willing to risk their career and possibly their life to help expose the truth. The answer came from an unexpected source. Timothy McNeil, a master stonemason who had been working on St. Patrick's Cathedral since construction began, had approached Margaret after hearing rumors about her investigation through the tight-knit network of Irish immigrant families. McNeil had his own reasons for questioning Bishop Hughes's methods, having witnessed strange activities at the construction site that had troubled his conscience for months. McNeil explained that certain areas of the cathedral's foundation had been declared off-limits to regular construction workers, with only specially selected crews allowed to work in those sections. Tools and materials would disappear from secure storage areas, and he had occasionally heard sounds from beneath the foundation that seemed inconsistent with normal construction activity. Most troubling, several workers who had asked too many questions about the restricted areas had been dismissed from the project and had subsequently left New York entirely, allegedly to seek work in other cities. The stonemason's detailed knowledge of the cathedral's layout, combined with his access to construction areas during off hours, made him the perfect ally for what Margaret was planning. But McNeil's participation would require him to violate his professional obligations to the church that employed him and potentially expose himself to the same fate that had befallen the missing priests. Margaret had learned from her brother's example that challenging Bishop Hughes directly was futile. Instead, she would need to gather irrefutable evidence and present it to authorities who were independent of church influence. The challenge was determining which civil officials could be trusted with information that would inevitably create a massive scandal affecting thousands of innocent Catholic families. Samuel Hartwell suggested approaching the New York City coroner, Dr. Abraham Phelps, a Protestant physician whose professional integrity was widely respected and whose legal authority to investigate suspicious deaths would provide official legitimacy for any discoveries they made. But involving civil authorities would require them to produce evidence compelling enough to justify investigating sacred ground, evidence that could only be obtained by illegally entering the sealed catacomb chambers. The decision to proceed required each conspirator to confront the possibility that their actions might trigger violent retaliation against Catholic communities throughout the city. Protestant nativists had been seeking excuses to attack Catholic institutions, and revelations about mass murder committed by church leadership might provide the justification for mob violence that could destroy everything Catholic immigrants had built in America. Margaret understood this risk better than anyone. Her family had fled Ireland to escape religious persecution, and she had watched her brother dedicate his life to serving Irish immigrants who had nowhere else to turn for spiritual guidance and community support. Exposing Bishop Hughes might save future victims, but it would also potentially destroy the church that provided essential services to the most vulnerable members of New York's population. Yet the alternative was allowing Hughes to continue his reign of terror, knowing that other priests who questioned his authority would face the same fate as her brother. Margaret had come to believe that authentic Catholic faith required confronting corruption within church hierarchy, that true loyalty to Catholic principles meant refusing to permit sacred authority to be used for evil purposes. On the night of February 14, 1851, Margaret O'Brien, Samuel Hartwell, and Timothy McNeil entered St. Patrick's Cathedral construction site carrying lanterns, excavation tools, and Dr. Whitmore's maps of the underground chambers. McNeil's knowledge of the building's security procedures allowed them to avoid the night watchman, and his expertise with stone construction enabled him to locate the sealed entrance to the catacombs without damaging surrounding foundation work. The chamber they uncovered exceeded their worst expectations. 89 human remains were arranged in systematic rows, each body positioned to face a crude altar where ritualistic objects suggested that Dr. Whitmore had conducted what he believed were scientific experiments in spiritual purification. Personal effects found with each body confirmed the identities of missing priests and provided evidence of their final experiences that was too horrible to be fully documented in any public report. More disturbing than the physical evidence were the written records found in Dr. Whitmore's personal effects, documents that revealed the true scope of Bishop Hughes's ambitions for American Catholicism. The bishop had been corresponding with conservative Catholic leaders in Europe about methods for suppressing what they viewed as dangerous democratic tendencies within American Catholic communities. Hughes had viewed his tribunal as a pilot program for techniques that could eventually be employed throughout Catholic America to ensure absolute obedience to ecclesiastical authority. Samuel Hartwell's medical examination of the remains revealed evidence of systematic torture designed to maximize psychological trauma while minimizing the risk of premature death. Dr. Whitmore had been perfecting techniques for breaking human resistance that could be employed against any Catholic who showed signs of what church authorities considered excessive independence or Protestant-influenced individualism. Margaret's discovery of her brother's personal effects, including his final letter describing his realization that he was going to be murdered for opposing church corruption, provided the emotional motivation she needed to ensure that their evidence would not be suppressed or dismissed. Patrick O'Sullivan had died believing that his sacrifice might somehow help other priests avoid the same fate, and Margaret was determined to honor that hope by making his death count for something meaningful. The documentation they gathered from the catacomb chambers filled 3 large satchels with evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as forgery. Dr. Whitmore's obsessive record-keeping had created an archive of church corruption. That was too detailed and too specific to be anything other than authentic first-hand testimony from someone intimately involved in the crimes. On February 20th, 1851, Margaret O'Brien walked into Dr. Abraham Phelps's office carrying evidence that would transform American Catholic history. The coroner's initial skepticism quickly gave way to horror as he examined medical records, personal effects, and physical remains that told a story of systematic murder committed under religious authority. Dr. Phelps realized that he was confronting crimes that exceeded anything in his professional experience, atrocities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between religious faith and moral behavior. The coroner's investigation proceeded with careful attention to legal procedures that would ensure any charges brought against church officials could withstand scrutiny from the most skilled defense attorneys. Dr. Phelps understood that Bishop Hughes commanded resources and influence that could potentially suppress even the most damning evidence if proper legal protocols were not followed meticulously. The official exhumation of the catacomb chambers began on March 3, 1851, conducted under the supervision of city officials, medical experts, and legal observers who could provide independent testimony about the evidence discovered beneath St. Patrick's Cathedral. The process required 3 weeks to complete, as each body was carefully documented and each piece of evidence was catalogued, according to procedures that would ensure its admissibility in criminal proceedings. Bishop Hughes's initial response was to deny any knowledge of the underground chambers, claiming that they represented some unknown previous use of the cathedral site that had been concealed from church authorities. But Dr. Whitmore's detailed journals, discovered among his personal effects in the chambers, provided testimony that directly implicated Hughes in planning and supervising the systematic murder of 89 individuals. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Hughes's most powerful allies could not prevent criminal charges from being filed. The bishop was arrested on March 26, 1851, becoming the highest-ranking Catholic official in American history to face prosecution for crimes committed under church authority. The scandal sent shockwaves through Catholic communities throughout the United States and provided ammunition for Protestant groups who had long argued that Catholic immigrants posed a threat to American democratic institutions. But Margaret O'Brien had anticipated this reaction, and she had prepared a response that would demonstrate that authentic Catholic faith was incompatible with the corruption Hughes represented. Working with reform-minded Catholic clergy who had been horrified by the revelations, she helped organize Catholic communities to support the prosecution of church officials who had betrayed their sacred responsibilities. The trial that began in September 1851 attracted international attention as the most significant confrontation between religious authority and civil law in American history. Bishop Hughes's defense team argued that civil courts lacked jurisdiction over internal church matters, that the prosecution represented Protestant persecution of Catholic leadership, and that the evidence had been obtained through illegal violation of sacred ground. Margaret's testimony proved crucial in demonstrating that the crimes represented betrayal of Catholic principles rather than legitimate exercise of church authority. Her detailed knowledge of her brother's character and her careful documentation of his final communications provided evidence that the victims had been faithful Catholics who were murdered for opposing corruption rather than for challenging authentic religious doctrine. Samuel Hartwell's medical testimony explained the systematic nature of the torture methods employed in the catacomb chambers, evidence that demonstrated the premeditated and calculated nature of crimes that could not be dismissed as isolated incidents of religious enthusiasm or disciplinary excess. His copies of Dr. Whitmore's journals provided first-hand documentation of criminal activities that had been carefully planned and methodically executed over several years. Timothy McNeil's testimony about suspicious activities at the cathedral construction site provided evidence that the murders had been integrated into the building project from its earliest stages. that the catacomb chambers had been deliberately designed to conceal evidence of systematic killing. His professional expertise as a master stonemason gave credibility to his observations about construction activities that were inconsistent with legitimate building projects. The conviction of Bishop John Hughes on 89 counts of first-degree murder represented a watershed moment in American religious history, demonstrating that religious authority could not be used to shield criminal activity from legal accountability. The sentence of death, carried out on November 15, 1852, sent a clear message that American law would not tolerate the abuse of sacred trust regardless of the perpetrator's institutional position. But the consequences of Margaret's investigation extended far beyond the punishment of individual criminals. The revelations about systematic corruption within Catholic hierarchy triggered reforms throughout American Catholic institutions, as church leaders recognized that their credibility depended on demonstrating commitment to moral principles that transcended institutional self-interest. Margaret O'Brien became a symbol of the possibility that individual courage could challenge institutional corruption, that ordinary people possess the power to hold even the most powerful authorities accountable for their actions. Her willingness to risk everything to seek justice for her brother inspired other victims of institutional abuse to come forward with their own stories, creating a movement for transparency and accountability that transformed American Catholic culture. The reforms that followed Hughes's conviction included establishment of independent oversight mechanisms for investigating allegations of clerical misconduct, implementation of financial transparency requirements that prevented the misuse of church resources, and creation of democratic participation structures that gave ordinary Catholics more influence over church policies and leadership decisions. Most importantly, the scandal demonstrated that authentic religious faith required confronting corruption within religious institutions, that true loyalty to sacred principles meant refusing to permit ecclesiastical authority to be used for evil purposes. Margaret's example showed that protecting religious freedom meant ensuring that religious institutions maintained the moral credibility necessary to serve their communities effectively. The legacy of Margaret O'Brien's investigation continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about institutional accountability and the responsibility of ordinary citizens to challenge authority when it becomes corrupt. Her story reminds us that the most powerful weapon against institutional evil is often the determination of individuals who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable simply because it is sanctioned by powerful institutions. Today, as we walk past St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, we can remember that beneath its magnificent Gothic architecture lies a reminder that even the most sacred institutions are only as trustworthy as the individuals who lead them, and that protecting religious freedom requires eternal vigilance against those who would exploit faith for personal gain. Margaret O'Brien's courage in 1851 helped ensure that American Catholicism would develop along democratic lines that honored both religious tradition and individual conscience, creating a model for religious freedom that continues to inspire believers and skeptics alike. The truth about Bishop Hughes's crimes was preserved not because institutional authorities chose to investigate themselves, but because ordinary people like Margaret O'Brien refused to accept official silence about obvious injustice. Their example reminds us that in any society, at any time, the difference between civilization and barbarism might depend on individuals who are willing to ask uncomfortable questions, seek dangerous truths, and risk everything to ensure that power is held accountable to moral principle. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.